All right. So we had talked on the Friday before break about the Yucca Mountain project. So this was supposed to be a large-scale, long-term, high-level nuclear waste storage facility that was going to be in kind of west central Nevada in some of the military controlled land out there. And basically, there was a whole bunch of problems with the project, including having unreliable funding structure, having a lot of waste and mismanagement over the years, not having community engagement, and having poor planning as far as assessing seismic hazards and that sort of thing. And so, excuse me. So that's kind of an example of like what not to do when you're doing these types of projects. But today I want to talk about a different project where actually the DOE has done a very good job of getting this going. And this is the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. So the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, or the WIPP, is a facility kind of out in the middle of nowhere, east of Carlsbad, New Mexico. And as its name suggests, it's a pilot plant, so it's not a full-scale operation, but they want to demonstrate how we can do safe disposal and storage of high-level nuclear waste while protecting workers, the public, and the environment. So this is kind of what it looks like. Again, it's way out there, middle of the plains of the Permian Basin, pretty far away from anybody. So the way the WIPP works is that they've got a series of these chambers that they have drilled into salt. And I'll explain why the salt is important in a minute, but it's about a little over 2,000 feet below the surface, and it has a footprint of, several thousand feet on each side. So it's a pretty, it sounds large, but in terms of being able to store a large amount of nuclear waste, it's actually a fairly modest size, but it could be made bigger. So they've got a lot of kind of infrastructure, just to keep the ventilation and everything in there going. The reason that they use salt, so it's drilled into the Salado Formation, which, as the name suggests, is salt. It's mostly halite, which is better known as sodium chloride or table salt. And it's Permian in age. And those of you who are in my petrophysics class know that I go on and on and on about how these uppermost Permian evaporite rocks are kind of the cap over the whole hydrocarbon-bearing sequence in the Permian Basin. So it's a geologically important thing. It's important also for energy production. But the thing about salt is that it looks like a rock. Oh, you know what? I have some of this salt up in my office. I'll bring it on Friday. It looks like a rock. Okay, that's why we call it rock salt. But here's the thing. It actually has a very large but finite viscosity. So if you drill a hole in salt, it might look like nothing's happening. But over time, like over a time scale of decades, the salt will creep and close up the hole. So the deal is that they go in, they drill, excavate these huge chambers, and they fill it with casts of high-level nuclear waste. And over time, the salt is just going to creep close and encase the waste more or less permanently. The other feature of salt is that it generally has very, very low permeability. So it doesn't have much in the way of open pore space. And so it's very, very difficult for fluids to move around it. So it sounds like a win-win scenario, which is pretty cool. Question over here.
Are they doing that creep, like they heating it and all that?
No, that's a good question, but it happens, rapidly enough, geologically speaking, that they can basically just let it go. So for like a cavern of this size here, which is 3-4 meters on each side, that will close up probably on a time scale of about 100 years. Which, if you remember when we were talking about the dry casks that they use to store nuclear waste on site at power plants, those are good for a couple of centuries just because, concrete is a pretty robust material. So If the casks are good enough to just sit there for a while until the salt creeps around it over decades to, maybe a century, that's good. You really don't have to do anything to it. If you did try to stimulate it, you really just kind of be throwing money down the drain because it's going to close up anyway. You don't really have to worry about it. Okay, now there is one issue that we haven't really talked about, which is that they don't generate any nuclear waste at the WIPP. It's simply a storage facility. And you have to get the nuclear waste there from the places where it's generated. So most of the waste that goes to WIPP comes either from federal facilities where they're doing, things like nuclear weapons research, or also things related to nuclear power, and nuclear power plants around the country. So right now, there are only a few permitted routes that this nuclear waste can take. And the reason for that is that you don't want trucks just carrying high-level nuclear waste all over the place, right? You want to have very tight control on where the stuff goes in case, God forbid, something happens. So the way it works right now is it's really just the blue, the green, and the brown right here that are permitted to be used to carry the waste to the WIPP down here. So, for example, you can see, let's use an example. So the Argonne National Lab up here in Illinois, they're generating radioisotopes there through a variety of different research projects. And they could only truck that over Interstate 80 and then down I-25 and then down US 285 down to the WIPP. So that's the only way that they can get there. And that kind of makes sense. And, this is something actually that, the U.S. Department of Transportation, they regularly regulate, that's a tricky phrase, regularly regulate, where hazardous materials can go. A lot of the time, if you're driving through a city, you'll see a sign that says, hazardous material must take this particular route around the city. You can't just, you can't take hazardous material right through downtown Houston on I-10, because what if something happened? So anyway, they already regulate that. They do a good job of doing this. Okay, but the main question is, do you have a question? Yeah. Yeah, so that's a really good question. So, are there plans to expand the network? So, right now, this is still just a pilot plant, and I don't have any knowledge about whether there's any plans to really scale it up anytime in the future. So right now, this is kind of what we got. So yeah, places like Comanche Peak, South Texas, a lot of other nuclear facilities around the country, they're still just kind of stuck with on-site storage for the time being. Okay, so why has the WIPP been successful in a way that Yucca Mountain was not? A lot of it has to do with community engagement. Now, I know I keep hammering on that, but it's really important. You can't just assume that if you're doing something that's good for sustainable energy, everybody's automatically going to be on board. So what they've done at Yucca Mountain, not Yucca Mountain, at the WIPP, is as far back as 1978, they formed a community group. It's called the New Mexico Environmental Evaluation Group. And they were formed as an independent overseer to the WIPP and any other Department of Energy activities that happen in the area. They hold community forums, they participate in the community, they've made educational investments, they're very involved in the community, they have career fairs and small business programs and stuff like that. So they very much want to have a positive impact on the local community. And that goes a long way towards building goodwill. So one of the things that I hope you got out of the homework assignment, particularly in writing the op-ed component of that, is that your job really with community engagement is not to try to convince people necessarily that you're right, but you want to make them feel comfortable supporting what you do. And part of making people feel comfortable is saying, hey, we're part of the community. Look, we're here, we're doing other great stuff. you know, if we're doing this other great stuff, you can probably trust us to do great stuff with our sustainable energy project as well. So it's a big part of that. It's just increasing people's comfort level. Okay, so that's the main thing about the whip. They have whipped it good. Sorry, I could not avoid saying. All right, so a little bit extra on nuclear power. So right now, the United States is kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of how much of our power is generated from nuclear energy. As of 2023, which is where I've got these figures from, we were producing 18.2% of our energy from nuclear. Now, that varies widely within the country. If you look at just the ERCOT region, which is most of Texas, that is lower than that. And I don't want to throw a number out there because I don't remember exactly what it is, but I want to say it's on the order of 7%. So that's about half of the national average. But other parts of the country have a lot more nuclear power. So it kind of balances out. France is top of the heap with almost 63% of their electricity coming from nuclear power. But there's been some interesting things going on with nuclear energy, specifically in Europe, that we'll get to in a minute. Okay. This is the status of nuclear power deployment. And again, this is as of April 2023. And so the countries that are in dark blue, those are the ones that currently have reactors and they're looking at building new reactors. Here in the United States, the Vogtle plant down in Georgia actually came online earlier this year, which is our newest nuclear facility. And it sounds like if Meta and these other tech companies go through with their plans, we're going to be having a lot more nuclear deployment within the U.S. in the coming decades, which is, you know, a good thing. We'll talk in the next unit on microgrids and energy storage. We'll talk about the importance of balancing the grid and having a firm base load, which, you know, nuclear and geothermal are really the good candidates for that sort of thing. So that's the dark blue. The other things that I want to point out are the countries that are in red and in black. Red countries, those are ones where they have operational reactors, but they're looking at phasing out nuclear power generation. And then the countries that are outlined in black here are countries where actually nuclear power is illegal. And so you're probably asking yourself, why in the world would you just outlaw nuclear energy? Well, there are reasons for that. And I want to point out a couple of those. So this is a plot of the amount of either new nuclear capacity coming online or nuclear capacity being decommissioned per year going back to the 1950s. And there's a couple of things that I want to point out. I've noted a couple of, or three major events on here. The first is 3 Mile Island. This is a well-publicized nuclear incident at a reactor in Sylvania, New York. Gosh, I wish I should have looked that up. Anywhere, somewhere in the Northeast. And in that particular year, there was that incident. It was a little bit of an accident. They didn't actually have a meltdown, but it made people nervous, particularly within the US. And you can see associated with that, there was a reduction in the amount of nuclear capacity coming online and actually some amount being decommissioned. Next thing I want to point out, the Chernobyl accident, 1986. That was a time of very rapid nuclear deployment, but following that, you can see a very strong decline in the amount of nuclear capacity coming online. And then finally, after the Fukushima accident associated with the earthquake in Japan in 2011, a lot of decommissioned nuclear power. So the thing is, anytime that there is a nuclear incident, people get very, very nervous and start to pull back on nuclear deployment because there's this perception that nuclear power is somehow dangerous and hard to control. And anytime that there's a little bit of an accident, that increases that perception within the local population. So the point here is that a lot of nationwide bans tend to come about following disasters. So in Italy, they held a referendum. People voted. They banned nuclear power. This is following the Chernobyl disaster. Same thing in Uruguay. Okay, Germany enacted this new Atomic Energy Act after the Fukushima accident, aimed at phasing out a lot of their nuclear energy. And Spain is kind of an interesting case that they actually had a leak at one of their power plants in 2007. And they said, well, okay, you know what? Let's shut this stuff down. This is no good. So that's kind of an interesting aspect to the nuclear energy picture, is that anytime there's a bit of an incident, people tend to get a little bit squeamish about it. And so this is something where, again, education, community engagement can help if you're interested in deploying more nuclear power. Okay, I will defer the answer to this question until Friday, but I'll give you a hint. Sometimes it is more carbon intensive energy. So think about that. Enjoy the rest of your rainy Wednesday, and I'll see you all here on Friday.